discussing racism towards Indigenous Australians. I will be discussing what racism is, the types of racism, and how it impacts mental health, employment, and opportunities. In the presentation, I will be discussing the reason for the topic choice, the field of interest it relates to, the nature of the problem, and the contributions I aim to make as a social worker. This conference stems from the recent Black Lives Matter movement that is making news headlines. This movement began in the United States and was sparked due to the racial disparities in policing, highlighting the prevalence of racial inequality. However, despite the movement beginning in the US, racism is still happening in our own backyard in Australia. These statistics show how prevalent racism is in Australia. Racism can be linked to race and ethnic origins. Race is a socially constructed category of identification based on genetic and physical characteristics such as skin color or hair texture. Meanwhile, ethnicity is linked to cultural expression and identification, language, and religion. Racism is directly linked to race and ethnic differences. Racism is a social system that maintains unfair balance of power between ethnic racial groups. It uses power to devalue, disempower, and limit access to resources and opportunities for marginalized groups. It can manifest through beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, practices, and stereotypes. There are three types of racism. Internalized racism is when an individual internalizes the racist attitudes, beliefs, and ideologies they hear and experience about their own race and ethnicity. This can detrimentally impact an individual's self-concept and well-being. Interpersonal racism consists of daily interactions and negative discriminatory behaviours targeted at minority groups. Systematic racism is the way racism is embodied in laws, practices, and policies of society that oppress, disadvantage, or neglect racial groups marked as inferior. The topic of racism can be linked to diversity and social injustice. Diversity is linked to parameters including physical characteristics such as race, gender, disability, religion, cultural beliefs, and sexual preference. Social justice is about recognizing and respecting differences within groups and eliminating oppression. It is about providing an opportunity to participate equally in social and political life. It involves having fairness in healthcare, employment, housing, and education. Therefore, racism violates social justice. Racism can be summarized as a lack of acceptance for diversity and a violation of social justice. To relate this to the context of Indigenous Australians, the history of Indigenous Australians over the past 200 years is one of great suffering. However, Indigenous Australians continue to face interpersonal and institutional racism to this day. This has detrimental impacts on health and mental health outcomes, as well as accessibility to resources and opportunities. Concerningly, 46% of Indigenous Australians experienced racial prejudice in the last 6 months alone. Racism is a key determinant of health and has been directly linked to health problems such as high blood pressure, heart disease, low birth weight, and premature birth. Racism creates stress and negative emotions which can detrimentally impact the various systems of the body. Racism impacts healthcare-seeking behaviours and adherence to medical regimes. An individual's perception and anticipation of discrimination can create a level of mistrust towards the healthcare system and create disengagement and avoidance of healthcare settings. In terms of mental health, racism has been associated with lower self-esteem and higher anxiety, stress, depression, suicide ideation, aggression, and behavioural problems. Stereotyping threat is another issue that can affect mental health. This is anxieties that activate when negative stereotypes about one group are salient. Racism also impacts employment and education outcomes and access to opportunities. Racist-inspired policies has created intergenerational underachievement and alienation in education settings. Also, mistrust and fear of racism has also created fear and avoidance of schooling for some Indigenous children. The contribution I aim to make as an emerging social worker is to become a culturally competent practitioner. Social work settings serve clients from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds, which require client-centered services and systems to gain optimal healthcare. Cultural competence is a strategy to address this issue. This involves meeting the cultural, social, and communication needs of the diverse clientele. Cultural competence is a set of behaviours, attitudes, and policies that enable a service to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. It is a combination of knowledge, skills, and that show respect for all individuals, groups, and communities, regardless of race, ethnicity, language backgrounds, class, culture, religions, and spiritual backgrounds. Cultural competence is a combination of self and cultural awareness. It involves having an awareness of one's own personal biases, prejudices, and cultural biases, values, and beliefs. Racism, sexism, privilege, and discrimination are all key topics that practitioners should gain knowledge about. Having cross-cultural skills and knowledge while remaining open and adaptive to clients can create strong therapeutic relationships and positive outcomes for clients. Cultural humility is one of the two key concepts that help towards this contribution. It involves developing an awareness of the limitations practitioners have in their ability to understand a client's worldview and their cultural background. It involves accepting not knowing all and understanding that each client's situation is unique. It is a lifelong, ongoing self-reflection of one's personal views, values, biases, and privileges. The final concept I'm discussing today is culturally safe environments. Culturally safe environments are environments that are safe for Indigenous Australians. This means that there is no assault, challenge, or denial of the identity or experience of clientele. It involves shared respect, the experience of learning together with dignity, and the removal of barriers for the optimal health, well-being, and safety of clientele. Whilst the contributions I've discussed will not completely remove racism from Australia, it will help create a culturally safe and comfortable environment where Indigenous Australians feel safe, understood, and respected. Racism is prevalent in modern Australia, and it has detrimental impacts on the health and well-being of Indigenous Australians. It demonstrates a lack of acceptance for diversity and is a social injustice. It has various impacts on Indigenous Australians. However, cultural competence, cultural humility, and providing culturally safe environments are some ways I aim to address the issue of racism as a social work practitioner. There is still a lot of work to be done to remove racism for our society, but this is a small step we can make